The cold metal of Sergeant Hartman's rifle barrel pressing against my spine was the only thing keeping me from collapsing. The whole world had shrunk to that icy point of contact, and his voice, a harsh growl that cut through the fine, insistent drizzle. "Move, you useless coward." That's an order. Ahead of us, the field stretched like a rotted, sodden carpet, a stretch of land the maps called Sector 28 Charlie, but which we, the men who would die, knew by a more honest name, God's. It was where he had vomited war and left it to rot. The smell was the first thing that grabbed you by the throat. A thick, metallic odor, a mixture of churned mud, rust, damp gunpowder, and something deeper, older, the unmistakable breath of flesh that no longer belonged to. It was the scent of death on an industrial scale, and it clung to his clothes, seeped into his pores, and promised never to leave. My foot sank into the mud with an obscene sound. A squelch it seemed to echo across the devastated plain. I looked up. The field was a cemetery without crosses. Bodies, or pieces of them, dotted the landscape at angles life would never allow. An outstretched arm, fingers curled, as if pleading with the grace. A lone boot, with the foot still inside, stuck in the earth like a grotesque flag of surrender. Cracked helmets, broken rifles, and the faces of the dead were the worst part. Some were peaceful, almost asleep in the light rain. Others were frozen in a mask of terror, their mouths open in a silent scream that time would never erase. They were American, like me, boys from Ohio, Texas, California, who had told jokes in the barracks the night before, who had shown me yellowed photos of their girlfriends and dreamed of apple pie and a hot bath. Now, they were just obstacles in the mud, silent warnings of what the next misstep could do to me. Fear was no longer an emotion, it was a physical state. My heart hammered against my ribs with a violence that threatened to shatter them. My stomach was a knot of ice and acid. The air I tried to draw into my lungs felt thick and heavy, as if I were breathing death itself. Behind me, I heard one of the other recruits, a boy from Boston named O'Malley, begin to sob. A low, pathetic sob, the sound of an animal caught in a trap. Hartman didn't hesitate. The sound of his hand hitting O'Malley's helmet was dry and hollow. "Shut up, soldier, or I'll shut you up myself." The crying stopped, replaced by ragged, gasping. We were forced to advance not in file but spread out, a cruel tactic to ensure that if one of us stepped on a mine, it wouldn't take the other. Each of us was terribly alone on our own walk to the slaughterhouse. My eyes swept the ground in front of me, a desperate dance between searching for a detonator's wire, a suspicious protrusion in the earth, and avoiding the remains of my comrade. I didn't want to step on one of them. It felt like the ultimate desecration, the final insult to a life already stolen. What they didn't tell us, what Hartman conveniently omitted, is that the enemy was sadistic. They buried mines underneath of the body. The logic was diabolical. A soldier would try to retrieve a fallen comrade's dog or simply move it out of respect, and all hell would break loose to find him. The field wasn't just mine. It was a trap within a trap, a brutal lesson in how war destroys not just body, but human decency itself. And it was then, as I passed a young Marine whose face was turned skyward, his blue eyes still open and startled, that I saw something clutched in his hand. It wasn't a gun, nor a grenade. It was something else, something that didn't belong in this place of horror and decay. And against all logic, against the fear screaming through my veins, I knew I had to see what it was. My name is Jack Riley, and before I was an identification number stamped on a metal plate, before I was a pair of boots sinking into the German mud, I was a boy from Elm Creek, Nebraska. Thinking of Elm Creek as I stood in the middle of that death camp was like trying to imagine the sun sinking into the ocean floor. The memory was so distant, so pure, it felt like it belonged to someone else, to a life I'd read about in a book. But it was mine. God, it was mine. I clung to it with the strength of a man clinging to a piece of driftwood in the middle of a shipwreck. The face of that dead soldier before me, his blue eyes glazed over to a sky I could no longer see, somehow transported me away from the smell of decay and the fear that paralyzed. For a second, he wasn't a stranger. He was every boy I'd ever known, every face that smiled at me on the main street of Elm Creek. He could have been me. He was Sam. Sam was my best friend. We grew up together, our home separated only by a cornfield that turned golden and whispering in late summer. Our lives were measured in season, not battle. Summer meant fishing in the creek, sunburned skin, the taste of peanut butter sandwiches our mothers wrapped in wax paper. Fall was harvest, the smell of earth and dry leaves, the hard work that left us exhausted but honest. Winter brought a thick, silent snow that blanketed the world, and we sat by the radio, listening to tales of adventure, never imagining that the greatest and most terrifying of them was brewing on the other side of the world. Spring was the thaw, the mud a different mud, that smelled of life and promise, not death, and the plans we made for the future. Sam wanted to be an engineer, to build bridges that connected cities. Me. I was simpler. He worked at Mr. Abernathy's hardware store, and he liked it. I liked the smell of sawdust and oil, the feel of a well-made tool in my hand, helping people fix things that were broken. It was a world of problems that could be solved with a hammer, a screw, or a little elbow grease. A logical and tangible world. My house was a 2-story white clapboard building with a front porch where my father, a quiet man hardened by the Great War, would sit every evening, smoking his pipe and watching the sunset. He never spoke of France, of the trenches, but I saw the war in his eyes sometimes, a distant emptiness I didn't understand. Now, in the midst of my own hell, I finally understood. It was the look of a man who saw things the human soul was not meant to process. My mother was the heart of the house. Her world was the kitchen, the garden, the soft sound of her voice humming as she prepared dinner. The smell of her bread baking was the scent of security, of unconditional love. I had a younger sister, Sarah, whose braids I used to pull and who followed me everywhere like a faithful shadow. Life was simple. It was predictable. It was good. The war, for us, was something distant. Headlines in the newspaper that my father read with a frown. Crackling voices on the radio talking about places with strange names. Poland, Pearl Harbor. It seemed to be happening on another planet. Until it wasn't. I remember the day Sam and I decided to enlist. We were filled with naive patriotism, fueled by posters and speeches. We were going to defend our country, fight evil, be heroes. It seemed like a grand adventure, the greatest of all. My father said nothing. He just looked at me, and in that look I saw his fear and resignation. He knew. He knew the boy who was leaving wouldn't be the same boy who returned, if he returned at all. My mother wept silently, hugging me with a strength that left me breathless on the train station platform. The scent of her perfume, lavender and worry, clung to my jacket for days. Sarah gave me a drawing of our house, with stick figures representing our family, all smiling under a bright yellow sun. "So you don't forget to come home, Jack," she said. I tucked that drawing into the breast pocket of my uniform, and now, feeling the crumpled paper against my rib, it felt like the only real thing in this universe of madness. The transition from the world of Elm Creek to the world of war was brutal. The training hardened us, drained us of our individuality, and rebuilt us like cogs in a machine. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for the Hurtgen fog. Mud, endless rain, splintered trees that looked like skeletal claws scratching at the sky, and the constant sound of artillery, which became the pulse of the world. And death, death everywhere, sudden, random, impersonal. This was where the adventure ended and the nightmare began. This was where I realized we weren't fixing the world. We were simply being broken along with it, forced to cross a field of human wreckage, with a sergeant's voice at our backs reminding us that our lives were worth less than advancing a few feet of useless mud. And somewhere, beneath all that terror, the boy who liked the smell of sawdust was still there, wondering how the hell the world could have gone so wrong. The first time the war broke me, it wasn't with a bullet or the roar of a mortar round. It was with silence. An icy silence, broken only by the sound of my own teeth chattering uncontrollably and the endless dripping of rain on my helmet. It happened 3 weeks after we arrived at the Hurtgen front, when the naivete of Elm Creek hadn't yet been completely beaten out. The mission, as sold to us by Lieutenant Davies, a young man fresh out of West Point with a map cleaner than his conscience, was simple: seize and hold a small observation post on an insignificant hill, nicknamed Hill 203. A walk in the park, boys, he said, with a smile that didn't reach his eye. "Go, look, and come back for breakfast." We were an 8-man squad. Me, Sam, and a boy from South Dakota named Peterson, who had the most honest face I'd ever seen, a speck of freckles and a painful optimism. He showed us pictures of his farm, his new tractor, and talked about the smell of the earth after spring rain. A smell that, he said, was proof that God existed. The walk turned into a crawl through the mud under fire from a single German machine gun, an MG-42, which someone nicknamed Hitler's. The sound wasn't like the one in the movie. It was a ripping sound, as if the fabric of the universe were being ripped apart right next to your ear. We were trapped in a series of artillery craters halfway up the hill. We couldn't advance, we couldn't retreat. Lieutenant Davies, in his wisdom, had sent us with a day's rations and ammunition for a quick firefight. We were exposed, soaked, and night was falling. The first night was the worst. The cold of the German forest is different. It's a damp, penetrating cold that doesn't care how many layers of wet wool you're wearing. It seeps into your bones and settles like a parasite. We huddled together in the crater, trying to share what little body heat we had. Sam was shivering so hard beside me that I could feel the vibrations through the earth. Peterson, in his infinite kindness, offered his only candy bar to a whimpering recruit, saying his mother always said sugar helped to drive away fear. On the second day, the hunger began to truly gnaw. It wasn't the hunger I knew, the hunger that precedes a hearty dinner at my mother's table. It was an empty hunger, a hollow ache that started in my stomach and spread to every part of my body, leaving me weak, dizzy, and irritable. I would close my eyes and picture my mother's steak and potato, the warm bread with melted butter, the apple. The memories, once a comfort, were now a form of torture. Every sensory detail, the smell, the taste, the texture was so vivid my mouth filled with saliva, and the reality of chewing the last hard, tasteless cracker was an insult. Over the radio, we requested permission to retreat. Lieutenant Davies's response was cool, distant, the voice of a man looking at a map, not at the lives he had put at risk. Negative, hold position. Retirement is not an option. The humiliation began to set in. We were not soldiers holding a strategic line. We were forgotten chess pieces on a board, abandoned by an incompetent player. Our survival was less important than the appearance of success in the morning report. It was on the third night that we lost Peterson. He wasn't hit by a bullet. There was no glory, no bravery. He began to cough, a wet, deep sound that frightened us more than the enemy machine gun. His feet, immersed in the icy water and mud for nearly 72 hours, had swollen and blackened. Fever consumed him. He was delirious, calling for his mother, talking about fixing the pasture fence. We tried to keep him warm, giving him our last drops of water, but it was useless. He died just before dawn, not with a bang, but with a silent sigh. The boy who believed in God died of cold and neglect in a mud puddle, dreaming of his farmland. America's optimism died a little with us in that crater. The indignation I felt was a hot flame in my frozenness. He wasn't killed by the enemy. He was killed by a clean map, by a false smile, by the stupid ambition of an officer unwilling to admit a mistake. When the rescue squad finally arrived on the fourth day, we were pathetic figures, wraiths of mud, with sunken eyes and skeletal faces, carrying the rigid body of our friend. When we arrived back at base, muddy, hungry, defeated, and grieving, the first person we encountered was Sergeant Hart. He looked us up and down, his face a mask of contempt. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't offer a word of comfort. He stopped in front of us, smelled our misery, and said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "Look at the heroes of Hill 203. They look like a bunch of sewer rats. They lost a man because of a little rain. You disgust me." He spat on the ground near my boot. "Complete cleanup in 10 minutes, or you'll all be scrubbing the latrines with your tongue." At that moment, looking at his face, I understood. The war wasn't just against the Germans on the other side of the field. It was against the indifferent, against the cruelty of our own men. It was a machine designed to grind away not just our body, but our humanity, our dignity. Hartman didn't steal Peterson's life, but he stole the meaning of his death. And that was the first real wound, the one that taught me that survival was sometimes just a slow way to die. After Peterson's death, a kind of switch flipped inside me. The pain and outrage I felt in that crater didn't disappear. They simply froze, becoming a layer of ice around my heart. It was a survival mechanism, I suppose. If I felt the pain of every death, every injustice, the war would have consumed me within days. The first phase of this new existence was normalization. Death ceased to be a shocking event and became part of the routine, like rain, mud, and cold ration. We saw men fall every day, and our group's reaction shrank from collective grief to somber pragmatism. His scream, a dull thud, and then a quick exchange of glances. Who was that? Followed by get his ammo or see if he still has any cigarette. We ceased to be a group of young men from different states and became a collection of spare parts. When one of us fell, a new, frightened face would appear the next day to fill the void. A recruit who hadn't yet learned the most important rule. Don't learn anyone's name. Learning someone's name was giving death a face, a story. And stories were a luxury we could no longer afford. The bodies that once horrified us became part of the landscape. We used them as cover, as markers of terrain. The line between the sacred and the profane was completely erased by necessity. It's funny. Telling this now, to an audience I can't even see, is my way of ensuring those boys aren't forgotten, even the ones I forced myself not to know. Each life was an entire universe, with a mother at home, a youthful love, a foolish dream of building bridges like sand. If you think these stories matter, that the memory of men like Peterson and so many other nameless men needs to be honored, then give me a thumb, a like, as they say these days. Subscribe to hear the rest, because silence is what the enemies of memory crave most. It's a way of saying we remember, and that, believe me, means more than you can imagine to an old man. It means that the sound of their lives wasn't completely drowned out by the incessant noise of war, which was the second phase of our descent into hell, the assault on our senses. The sound of the Herdgun forest was a sickening symphony. The predominant sound wasn't gunfire, but artillery, a constant drumbeat, day and night. That became the new sound. Sometimes it was a distant rumble, a thunderclap that made the ground vibrate gently beneath our boots. Other times, it was a high-pitched, rising whistle that made us cower, praying our names weren't written on the shell. The worst was when the shells hit the trees. They called them tree bursts, airbursts. A blinding flash in the forest canopy, followed by a shower of metal and wood splinters. Oak splinters the size of daggers fell like hail, capable of piercing a helmet, a skull. We learned to fear trees more than the open sky. They, which should have been a symbol of life, had become accomplices to death. The ground shook so often that on the rare occasions when everything stopped, the stillness was disorienting. The world felt unstable beneath our feet, as if the earth itself were suffering from combat stress. And the smell. God, the smell. The sweet, cloying fragrance of decay was omnipresent, but other odors were added to it. The acrid smell of burnt cordite that scratched the back of the throat. The smell of splintered pine. The metallic, salty smell of fresh blood. And the smell of gangrene, a rotten, sweet odor that emanated from the medical tent, a constant reminder of what happened when a wound was not treated in time. Our own bodies stank of stale sweat, mud, and fear. We were animals living in dens, and the world smelled like a slaughterhouse. With my senses overloaded, my mind began to give way. The horror became internal. I saw good men, strong men, shatter like glass. A Texas soldier, a giant who could carry a heavy machine gun like a toy, was found one morning sitting in a mud puddle, babbling lullabies and building mud castles. Another, during a bombing raid, began running in circles, laughing hysterically, until a piece of shrapnel silenced. The 1,000-yard stare became commonplace. Men sat perfectly still, staring into space, their eyes empty of all thought or emotion. They were still breathing, but they were gone. The war had hollowed them out inside. I could feel it happening to me. The Jack of Elm Creek was fading, replaced by a more primitive creature. My thoughts became simple. Find food, stay dry, don't die. I lost track of time. There were no more Mondays or Sundays. There was only before the attack, during the bombing, and after the patrol. The world outside that muddy forest felt like a dream I'd had long ago. The drawing of my sister, Sarah, that I kept in my pocket was my only link to sanity, a fragile piece of paper against an avalanche of madness. And then, the violence escalated from a constant threat to an intimate, brutal reality. We were sent to take a ruined village called Schmidt. There was no longer the distance of artillery or the anonymity of a sniper shot. It was house to house, room to room fighting. There was the sound of grenades exploding in basement, the muffled scream, the smell of plaster and blood mingling. It was there that I killed a man for the first time, face to face. He was no older than me. He rushed through a door while I was checking a room, and we both stopped for a split second, our eyes meeting in a moment of mutual, terrifying recognition. He was a boy, like me. He was afraid, like me. But he wore a different uniform. There was no time to think. My training took over. The recoil of my rifle against my shoulder. The muffled sound. The hole that appeared in his chest. The surprise in his eyes before they went blank. He fell to the floor with the thud of a sack of potatoes. I vomited in the corner of the room. War had ceased to be something that happened with use and become something that wooed. The final escalation of horror was not seeing death, but becoming one of its agents. We left Schmidt 2 days later, leaving behind more than half our company, dead or wounded, and a piece of my soul I knew I would never recover. Hell was not another place we were going. This was what we had become. And the worst was yet to come. The pervasive horror of war, with its constant noise and nightmarish landscape, has the power to numb you. You grow accustomed to the smell of death, the shaking ground, the empty faces round you. You build a wall within yourself, a fortress to protect what remains of your sanity. My wall seemed impenetrable, built with the bricks of indifference and cemented with the coldness of survival. I thought nothing could touch me anymore. I thought I had seen the worst that human beings could do to themselves. And then, on a grey day indistinguishable from all the others, war decided to show me how naive I was. It didn't attack my fortress with an arm. It found a crack, a single vulnerability I had left unprotected, and exploited it with diabolical precision. That vulnerability was called Sam. He was the last piece of Elm Creek I carried with, the anchor that kept me connected to who I was before all this. And war took him from me, not with the fury of battle, but with the casual cruelty of a bored god playing dice with human life. There was a lull in the fighting, one of those strained, tense pauses where both sides seemed to pause for breath, to count their dead and rearm their weapon. We were in a makeshift trench at the edge of a muddy field, waiting for order. The rain had stopped, and a pale, sickly sun was trying to break the cloud. The air was heavy with the smell of wet earth and smoke. Sam sat beside me, wiping the mud from his rifle with a rag. He was thinner, his face angular and lined with exhaustion, but his eyes still held a glint of decency that the war had failed to dull. He smiled, a tired smile, and offered me a crumpled cigarette, the last in his pack. "Keep this, Jack," he said, his voice a little hoarse. "We'll smoke it when we get to Berlin." I laughed, a dry, mirthless sound. "If we get to Berlin, Sam, I'll buy you a whole carton." He looked out at the horizon, at the skeletal trees of the forest. "You know what I was thinking about? That old bridge over Willow Creek. The one we almost broke trying to jump with our bikes." I remembered the sound of the creaking wood, the plunge into the cold water, the belly aching loud. My dad always said someone needed to build a decent bridge there. He continued dreamily. "Out of stone. One that would last forever. I think that'll be the first thing I do when I get back." In that moment, he wasn't Private Samuel Jones. He was just Sam, the boy who wanted to build bridges. And for a moment, in that filthy trench thousands of miles from home, we weren't soldiers. We were two friends sitting on the porch, talking about the future. It was a moment of peace so profound, so real, we almost forgot where we were. That's when we heard the sound. Other sounds of war are brutal and direct. The rip of a machine gun, the boom of an explosion. But the sound of a mortar round is different. It's personal. It's a low whistle that starts out of nowhere and builds quickly. A sound that seems to be coming straight from and only you. It's the sound of the end of the world approaching at high speed. We both looked at each other. In that split second, I saw the same terror in his eyes that he must have seen in mine. There was no time to scream, to throw himself to the ground. There was only the whistle, which turned into a deafening scream, and then nothing. A white flash and a sound that wasn't a sound at all, but a force that ripped me from the ground and slammed me against the earthen wall of the train. The air was knocked from my lungs. The world became a high-pitched, deafening buzz. Darkness. When consciousness returned, in waves of pain and confusion, the buzzing was still there. The air was thick with the smell of scorched earth and something else, a hot, coppery scent I know all too well. Blood. I called his name, Sam. My voice was a scratchy whisper. The silence that followed was the most terrifying thing I'd ever heard. I crawled, my body protesting with every movement. The smoke began to clear, and I saw it. He was lying a few feet away, at the bottom of the crater the mortar had created. For a moment, my brain refused to process the scene. He appeared to be asleep, but then I saw the blood. There was so much blood. His tunic was soaked, a dark, spreading stain. I crawled to him, the ringing in my ears turning into my own sobs. Sam. Sam, talk to me. His eyes opened, but they weren't focused on me. They were staring at something far, far away. A trickle of blood trickled from the corner of his mouth. He tried to speak, but only a gurgling sound came out. I held him in my arm, cradling his head, desperately trying to stop the bleeding with my useless hand. It's going to be okay, Sam. The doctor is coming. You're going to be okay. I lied, tears streaming down my face and dripping onto it. He blinked slowly, and for a second, he seemed to recognize. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. The bridge, Jack, he whispered, his voice as weak as the rustle of dry leaves. We have to fix the bridge. He was no longer in Germany. He was home, at Willow Creek. In his last moment, his mind had taken him to the only place he felt safe. His eyes locked with mine, and I saw the light, the decency, the kindness drained from them, leaving behind only emptiness. His body grew heavy in my arm, and then he was gone. The ringing in my ears stopped, and the silence that followed was absolute, infinite. The whole world had stopped breathing with him. I stood there, holding my best friend's body, covered in his blood. It wasn't a scream of rage or pain. It was a primal scream of pure loss, a sound that ripped everything from me, leaving a void as vast and cold as the grey sky. The wall I had built didn't just crack, it was pulverized, and in its place, only the knowledge remained that a part of me, the best, had died with him in that crater. The Jack who dreamed of the future was buried there, in that foul mud, along with the boy who only wanted to build bridges. The world had shattered into fragments of memory and pain, and all that remained was now. And now was the mud, the barrel of Hartman's gun in my back field. The peace of God. We were back at the beginning of my story, but I was no longer the same man who had reached the edge of this abyss. The boy from Elm Creek was dead, buried in a crater with his best friend. The soldier who had built a wall of ice round his heart had been melted by grief. What remained of Jack Riley was a hollow shell, an automaton whose limbs still moved by pure instinct, but whose soul had already surrendered. Sam's death didn't make me afraid of death. It made me afraid of life. A life without him. A life where the only thing that awaited me was more mud, more scream, more nameless faces. So, as Hartman pushed us forward, into the minefield, a part of me felt a kind of sick relief. The end was there, just a few steps away, hidden beneath a thin layer of. Maybe I would find it. Maybe I could finally rest. My first step into the camp was like plunging into ice-cold water. The initial shock, the breathlessness. The mud gripped my boot with a hungry suction, as if the earth itself wanted to devour me. I lifted my foot for the second step, the movement slow, deliberate, every muscle in my body screaming in protest. My eyes, now trained by the carnage, swept the ground in a frantic dance. I wasn't just looking for mine. I saw the history of failure written in the earth. I saw the tracks of others who had tried to cross. I saw the outline of a crater where a man had been vaporized, leaving behind only a dark stain and eternal silence. The bodies of the dead soldiers were the markers of our progress. Passing each one was like passing a ghost. I saw Sam's face in them all. I saw Peterson's face. I saw my own face, covered in mud and despair. The air was so heavy it felt solid. I chewed it. It tasted of rust, rot, and fear. And the silence. It was an active, watchful silence. A silence that listened, that waited. A silence that knew that at any second it would be shattered by a flash and a scream. And then it happened. Not to me. To a boy to my right, about 20 yards away. A recruit whose name I didn't know, whose face I could barely remember. I heard a click, a small, almost insignificant, metallic sound. The sound of a fatal error. The boy froze, his eyes widened, and he looked down at his foot, as if he could somehow undo what he had done. For a second, time stopped. The entire universe held its breath. And then the world exploded. It wasn't a bang, it was an eruption. A column of earth, fire, and black smoke gushed from the ground. The sound was a physical blow that threw me to my knees, my ears screaming in pain. Shards of metal and something else, something soft and wet, rained down round. A high-pitched, inhuman scream was cut off almost instant. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing there, just a smoking hole in the ground. Hartman, from somewhere behind us, barked, "Keep moving." He was useless anyway. Keep fucking moving. No one said a word. We just stood up, shaking, and continued, each step now charged with the visceral knowledge of what awaited us. The death of that anonymous boy should have intensified my fear, but instead, it pushed me deeper into my apathy. The randomness of it all. A step to the left instead of the right. A moment of distraction. It was a lottery, and the house always was. I kept walking, but my mind was adrift. I talked to Sam. I apologized for not being faster, for not protecting. I promised him I would take care of his parents if I got out of there. I told him about the bridge he would build, made of stone, to last forever. And it was in the midst of this silent conversation with a ghost that my eyes fell on him. Another body, one of many, but this one was different. He was lying on his back, his helmet next to his head, revealing blonde, mud-stained hair. He was young, couldn't have been more than 18. His face was turned to the sky, and his eyes were open, fixed on a vision only he could see. But it wasn't his face that caught my attention. It was his hand. His right hand, clenched in the mud, held some, a dirty, crumpled piece of paper. My brain screamed at me to keep walking. Hardman would scream if he saw me hesitate. Every second standing in that field was an invitation to death. But I couldn't look away. There was something on that piece of paper, something that called to me. Without thinking, as if my body were being moved by an external force, I took a careful step toward it. Then another. I was beside him now, hovering over his body like an angel of death. I lowered myself slowly, my knees sinking into the cold mud. The smell of his blood was fresh. He hadn't been dead long. And then I saw what he held so tightly, even in death. It was a drawing. A child's drawing, done with crayon. The colors were blurred by the humidity, but the image was still clear. A crooked house with a smoking chimney, two large stick figures holding hands, and a small stick figure in the middle. And above it all, in the corner of the paper, a large, smiling yellow sun. The air caught in my throat. My heart, which I thought had stopped feeling anything, gave a painful. Slowly, with a trembling hand, I reached into the breast pocket of my tunic. My fingers found the crumpled paper I'd been carrying since the train station in Elm Creek. I pulled it out. My sister Sarah's drawing. A white clapboard house, smiling stick figure, a bright yellow sun. They were almost identical. They were the same dream, dreamed by two different boys on opposite sides of the world, both sent to die in this same shitty field. In that moment, he wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a number. He was a son. Maybe an older brother. A boy who, like me, carried the last piece of home in his pocket, like a talisman against the darkness. And he hadn't made it. The war had stolen his home, his yellow sun, his life. Everything. A wave of fury and sadness so overwhelming hit me it took my breath away. The whole world shrank to that drawing in that dead boy's hand. The noise of war faded. The fear of landmines vanished. Hartman, shouting my name in the distance, was just a buzzing mosquito. All that existed was that piece of paper. And I knew, with an absolute certainty that defied all logic and survival instinct, that I couldn't leave it there. That drawing couldn't be buried in the mud. It needed to be saved. It needed to be witnessed. And, in the middle of the field of death, under the empty gaze of an indifferent sky, I stopped and reached out to take it from his cold fingers. My fingers, trembling and numb from the cold, touched him. The dead soldier's skin was cold, wax, and his fingers were stiff round that last piece of a world that no longer existed. I expected an explosion. I expected the act of touching another human being on that cursed field to be the final transgression, the trigger that hell was waiting to consume me. I closed my eyes, waiting for the flash, the sound, the end. But nothing came, only silence. A silence so deep and heavy it seemed textured, like dark velvet covering the world. With a delicacy I hadn't known I still possessed, I released his fingers, one by one, and freed the drawing. The paper was damp and fragile. I folded it carefully and placed it in my pocket, next to my sister's drawing. Now I carried 2 worlds with, 2 homes, 2 yellow suns. The weight on my chest was unbearable. I stood up, and the rest of the crossing was a blur. I don't remember my feet moving. I don't remember dodging other bodies. My mind was blank, emptied by that final act of witnessing. It was as if, by picking up that drawing, I had absorbed that boy's life and death, and the burden was too heavy for my own soul to bear. When my feet finally found solid ground on the other side of the field, I simply collapsed. My knees gave way, and I fell face first into the mud, my body shaking with an exhaustion that went beyond the physical. It was a soul-deep exhaustion. Of the 12 men forced into that camp, only 5 emerged. We were specters, covered in mud and other people's blood, with the eyes of old, tortured animals. Sergeant Hartman came toward me. I expected a kick, a scream. He stood over me for a long moment. I lifted my head and looked at him, and I don't know what he saw in my face, but the anger in his own eyes wavered. Perhaps he saw the truth, that there was nothing more he could do to break me. The war had already done its work for him. He didn't say a word. He just turned and shouted at the other survivors to move. That silence from him was more shocking than any explosion. We continued in a trance until we found refuge in the ruins of a farmhouse, a stone barn whose roof had been ripped off by an artillery shell. Inside, far from the eyes of the countryside, the war finally paused. And the silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever experienced. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It wasn't the stillness of a summer night on Elm Creek. It was a thick silence, full of things unsaid, full of the screams we'd swallowed and the faces we couldn't. The distant, muffled sound of artillery was just a murmur now, the monster's dying heartbeat. Inside the barn, the only sound was the wind whizzing through the cracks in the stone walls and the steady drip of water from a broken beam into a puddle on the floor. Plug. Plug. Each drop was the tick of a clock measuring an eternity. The other 4 survivors scattered into the dark corners, each cowering in their own private island of misery. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. How do you put into words what we had just been through? How do you describe the sound of a man disintegrating or the weight of a child's drawing pulled from a cold hand? Words couldn't reach that place. So we sat in silence together, but terribly alone. Loneliness was the most faithful companion in war. Even surrounded by other men, you were fundamentally alone with your fear, your memory, your sin. And now, the loneliness I felt was an abyss. Sam was gone. His voice, which had so often filled the silence and driven away my fears, was gone forever. The silence now was only proof of his absence. It was a void shaped exactly like my best friend. I sat with my back against the cold, damp stone wall, with trembling fingers, pulled the 2 drawings from my pocket. I unfolded them side by side on my thigh. They were so similar. The same childish impulse to design a home, a place of safety and love. The same yellow sun. I stared at them for hours as the little daylight faded and the darkness of the barn swallowed us. Those 2 pieces of paper were all that mattered. They were proof that before we were soldiers, before we were target, we were sons. We were loved. We had a place in the world. War wasn't a battle between good and evil, between flags and ideology. It was a machine whose sole purpose was to take boys who drew yellow sums and turn them into bodies in the mud, erasing any trace of what they once dreamed of. The void inside me was vast. It wasn't just the pain of losing Sam. It was a vacuum of meaning. Nothing made sense anymore. Why were we there? Why did that blonde boy have to die? Why had I survived? There were no answers in the silence. There was only the echo of questions, spinning and spinning in the void, and the weight of to-paper worlds in my hand, and the certainty that the war would continue. But it was already over. All that remained was the long, silent walk through the ruin. For decades after the war ended, a question haunted me, echoing in the quiet moments before I fell asleep. Why me? Why did I survive the peace of God when so many others, better and braver than me, did not? I wasn't the strongest, nor the fastest, nor the smartest. I was just a kid from Nebraska who found himself in the wrong place at the wrong time. For a long time, the answer to that question eluded me, and survivor's guilt was a burden almost as heavy as the memories. I saw the faces of Sam, of Peterson, of the blond boy in the minefield, and felt a deep shame that I was still breathing the air they had been denied. I tried to live a normal life. I returned to Elm Creek, married my childhood sweetheart, had children. I went back to my job at the hardware store, fixing broken things, as if by fixing a faucet or a fence I could somehow fix what was broken inside me. But peace was never complete. The war was always there, a low hum beneath the surface of my daily life, a shadow at the edge of my vision. The change, the true catharsis, didn't come suddenly, like an epiphany. It came slowly, over the years, and began with those two crumpled drawings I kept in a small wooden box. Every now and then, I'd take them out to look at them. At first, they were just a reminder of the pain, the horror. But over time, I began to see something more. I began to understand what really happened in that ruined barn, in the silence that followed the climax of my personal war. In that moment, holding those two identical symbols of innocence, I had received a lesson. War, I realized, has a primary purpose, more fundamental than seizing territory or defeating army. Its true purpose is to erase individuality. It's to take a million boys like me, each with their own story, their own dreams, their own yellow sun, and reduce them to an anonymous man. The soldier, the unique, the body, the casual. The war wins when it convinces us that the boy on the other side of the crosshairs isn't like us, that he's the enemy, a concept, not a person. It wins when it makes us forget that he also has a little sister who draws pictures, a mother who waits for him, a best friend with whom he dreamed of building bridges. The act of standing in the middle of that minefield, the most illogical and suicidal act I could have committed, was, in fact, my only real victory in the entire war. By risking everything for that drawing, I was unconsciously rebelling against the fundamental purpose of war. I was saying no. I was saying, this boy is not a number. He is not a lump in the mud. He was someone. He had a home. And I see it. I bear witness. In that instant, human connection became more important than self-preservation. Memory became more important than the mission. And that, I finally understood, was the lesson. That was the reason I survived. I was not spared by chance. I was chosen to be a witness. I was charged with carrying not only my story, but his, and Sam's, and everyone else. My purpose was not to forget so I could live in peace. My purpose was to remember so their lives would not have been in vain. With this realization, the way I carried my memories changed. The pain of Sam's loss never diminished, but it ceased to be just a burden. It became a present. I began to live for both of us. Every sunrise I saw for him. Every time I hugged my children, I did so with the strength of two men. I didn't build bridges of stone, as he dreamed, but I spent my life trying to build other bridges of understanding, of kindness. I tried to fix the small broken things in my little corner of the world, because he didn't have the chance to fix the big one. His friendship didn't end in that crater. It transformed. It ceased to be a companion and became a moral compass, the north that guided all my actions. The lesson about life and death I learned was this: death in war is an industry, impersonal and efficient. But life is fragile, individual, and infinitely precious. Each life is its own universe, full of yellow suns and wooden bridges over streams. And the greatest crime of war is not the act of killing, but the act of erasing these universes, of pretending they never existed. Hope, if there is any to be found amidst so much carnage, is not in victory or praise. It is in the stubborn and defiant act of remembrance. It is in the ability of one human being to look at another, even a stranger dead in the mud, and recognize themselves. It is in the belief that a child's drawing can, in the end, be more powerful than an army, because it speaks a language all souls understand, the language of love and home. I carry this lesson with me every day. It is my armor against cynicism, my shield against despair. I did not return from war a hero. I returned a guardian of story, of memory, of the small pieces of paper that taught me everything I needed to know about what it means to be human. Today, I am an old man. My hair is white, my hands are stained with age, and my steps are slow. I live in a house not unlike the one I grew up in, and from my window I see cornfields stretching to the horizon, golden under the same Nebraska sun I remembered from the trenches. I have children, grandchildren. I have led a good life, a peaceful life. Anyone who looked at me would say I'm a man of peace. And, in a way, they would be right. But they don't see the forest growing behind my eyes. They don't hear the distant echo of artillery in the silence of the night. They don't feel the cold of the German mud that, at times, still seems to cling to my bone. People say time heals all wounds. It's a pretty lie, but it is a lie. Time doesn't heal. It only teaches you to live with the scars. Some scars are on the skin, others are in the soul, and these are the ones that never fade. In a small wooden box I keep in my nightstand drawer are my most precious possession. They aren't medals nor decoration. They are two yellowed, fragile pieces of paper. My sister Sarah's drawing and the blonde boy's whose name I never knew. I look at them almost every day. They are my map. They remind me of where I came from, of the hell I went through, and of the lesson it took everything I could to learn. They remind me that the peace I enjoy today was bought with the lives of boys who never had the chance to grow old, boys who carried their own yellow suns in their pockets. These two drawings, my sister's and that boy's, they are my story. But every soldier carried something, a photo, a letter, a memory of a smell or a song. It was their yellow sun, the anchor that tethered them to humanity amidst the madness. If you've ever held on to something like this, a small object that held the whole world for you in a difficult moment, tell me in the comments what it was. It's important to know that I'm not the only one who understands how something so small can keep us alive, how a piece of paper can be stronger than steel. Not a day goes by that I don't think of Sam. I see him in the faces of my grandchildren. I hear his laughter in the wind that blows across the field. He is with me, he and everyone else. They aren't ghosts that haunt me. They are part of who I am. They are the voices that remind me to appreciate the simple thing, the warmth of the sun, the taste of a hot meal, the sound of my wife's breathing as she sleeps beside me. They are the gifts they gave me, gifts they never got to enjoy. Sometime, when I close my eyes, I still feel the barrel of Hartmann's gun against my back. I still smell. I know a part of me never left him. I survive, yes, but the word survivor implies that the ordeal is over. And that's not true. War doesn't end when the shooting stops. It simply changes battlefield. It moves from the forests and ruined cities to the landscape of the mine, and there it wages a battle for the rest of its life. Sometimes I think I didn't come back from that war. I just learned to breathe outside of it. And in every breath, there's a gratitude and a sadness so deep there are no words to describe them. I am the keeper of their story, the last sentinel of their memory, and I will continue to be until the day I join them. Until then, I look at my Nebraska sun, as yellow and bright as the ones those two boys drew, and wonder every day if the lesson has truly been learned.